Buenos días, sean todos bienvenidos al ciclo de conversación de BIMetrics 2022. El mundo está cambiando. ¿Cuántas veces hemos escuchado esto en los últimos años? La pandemia cambió la forma de comunicarnos, de transmitir nuestras ideas y aceleró procesos de transformación digital impensados hace algunos años. Muchas industrias han cambiado y mejorado. El área financiera no se quedó fuera. Nuestras formas de pago, nuevos productos y la irrupción de las fintechs y obviamente cambios regulatorios han cambiado la forma en que hoy día se entregan servicios a sus clientes. Dados estos cambios, hemos querido aportar como empresa a la discusión y entendimiento de estos nuevos procesos. Por ello planteamos una serie anual de conversatorios con 3 tópicos relevantes. 1. La transición de la LIBOR a la SOFR, donde muchas instituciones financieras a nivel mundial tendrán el desafío de cambiar todos sus contratos de derivados, ¿cierto?, desde un punto de vista legal, tecnológico y metodológico. 2. Machine Learning y su aplicación en las finanzas. Cómo esta tecnología nos permitirá de alguna forma mejorar el rendimiento de cálculos complejos en finanzas. Y 3. XVA. Todas las métricas relacionadas a análisis de riesgo de crédito para instrumentos de derivados y que permitirá finalmente a las instituciones financieras mejorar ciertos procesos de crédito. Sin duda esto será un aporte para el desarrollo financiero y tecnológico de la región. Mi nombre es Sebastián Valenzuela, soy Chief Product Officer y fundador de BIMetrics, una empresa que hoy considero como un game changer. Hemos, como empresa, básicamente desarrollado un sistema que a final de año lanzaremos básicamente y enfocado en el proceso de administración de ciclos de vida de inversión sin la necesidad de tediosas implementaciones y enfocado en un proceso de transformación digital para la administración de ciclos de vida de transacciones del punto de vista de servicios financieros totalmente en línea. Estos son servicios SaaS. Sean todos bienvenidos al primer ciclo de conversación BIMetrics 2022. Hoy nos acompaña el Dr. John Hall, profesor de la Universidad de Toronto y experto en riesgo y derivados. También estará con nosotros Luis Ángel Cisneros, líder de riesgo y servicios profesionales en México. Y Javiera Quiroga, que nos acompaña hoy como moderadora. Gracias, Javiera. Javiera es periodista y cuenta con una amplia experiencia en medios de financieros, tanto en Chile como en Estados Unidos.
Muchas gracias, Sebastián, por esa muy buena presentación y también muchas gracias a BIMetrics por la invitación a participar de este interesante ciclo de conferencias junto al Dr. Hall, cuya mirada sobre el cálculo de riesgos y el avance de la digitalización de los mercados es muy interesante y atractiva, especialmente en el contexto internacional que estamos viviendo hoy día. Antes de partir, les recuerdo algunas indicaciones para que tengamos un gran evento. Si tienen preguntas durante la presentación de Mr. Hall, les pedimos que por favor las escriban en el chat de comentarios que va a estar activo en su panel de control de Zoom. Las vamos a recopilar durante la conferencia para que después nuestro experto las responda en un espacio de diálogo que vamos a tener más adelante. Y también les recuerdo que hoy día tenemos la opción de escuchar la conferencia en español o en inglés y para eso solo deben cambiar el canal en la opción de interpretación que está en la barra de herramientas de Zoom. También les recuerdo que este webinar está siendo grabado y va a estar disponible para que lo revisen después. Ahora, vamos a un escenario práctico, así que les pido que nos situemos en el siguiente escenario. El sistema que utiliza su institución para hacer la gestión del ciclo transaccional de su portafolio de inversiones cuenta con un módulo de Market Data que incorpora derivados como futures y swaps, pero estos trabajan en base a la tasa de riesgos LIBOR, cuyo fin ya fue anunciado, así como también las tasas que van a comenzar a regir en su reemplazo. A la fecha existe todavía algo de confusión y poca claridad entre los diversos actores del mercado sobre cómo deberá hacerse la transición. ¿Qué medidas debería tomar una institución bancaria para actualizar su política de riesgos en base a este nuevo contexto? ¿Qué tipo de impacto tendrán estos cambios regulatorios que se están presentando en el mercado internacional en la gestión de activos financieros de las distintas industrias? Estas son algunas de las interrogantes que Dr. Hall va a exponer hoy día en su presentación y sobre las que vamos a estar conversando posteriormente junto a ustedes en este primer webinar. Así que ahora y sin más preámbulos, damos comienzo a la conferencia inaugural del Financial Challenge 2022. Los invitamos entonces a participar de la masterclass de LIBOR Phase Out a cargo del profesor John C. Hall.
Well, hello, it's a pleasure to be here. My name's John Hull, and I'm going to talk about the transition away from LIBOR, sometimes called the IBOR transition. It's a big upheaval for financial markets, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the history behind the transition. I'm going to talk about how the transition is being handled and what we can expect in the future. So first of all, a little bit of history. LIBOR, of course, is designed to monitor the rate at which banks borrow from each other. And using this as a reference rate dates back quite a long time. I think it was 1969 when this Greek banker, Minos Zombanikas, is said to have originated LIBOR. He arranged an $80 million loan from manufacturers Hanover to the Shah of Iran, with the interest rate based on the reported funding costs of reference banks. So as far as I know, that was the first loan where we were using the rates at which banks borrow as a reference rate for another loan. And of course, what's happened since then is that LIBOR has been created. The British Bankers Association created LIBOR fixings in 1986. Initially, there were only three currencies: US dollar, Japanese yen, and British pound. The Intercontinental Exchange, abbreviated ICE, took over the administration of LIBOR in 2014. And then, until recently, in fact, rates have been provided in five currencies: US dollar, Japanese yen, euro, Swiss franc, and British pound. And seven maturities: overnight, 1 week, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months. So that's 5 times 7, 35 different numbers provided every day. So say five currencies, 7 maturities. And these very popular rates, of course, they're used as reference rates for hundreds of trillions of dollars of transactions. And notice them using the word trillions there. Some people estimate that $500 trillion of transactions depend on the LIBOR fixings. So, for example, we could have a loan that maybe lasts 3 years, and we say the interest rate is 6-month LIBOR plus 50 basis points, which means that at the beginning of every 6-month period, you look and see what the LIBOR fixing is. The 6-month LIBOR fixing is for whatever currency we're talking about, add 50 basis points, and that's the interest rate that will apply for the next 6 months. Or alternatively, another example of the sort of deal that we might talk about is a 5-year swap where 3-month LIBOR is exchanged for 2.5%. So how were these LIBOR rates determined? Each day, 18 banks, actually it wasn't always 18 banks, it could be sort of anywhere between 11 and 18 banks, I think. But they were asked the question, which I've listed here: at what rate could you borrow funds? Were you to do so by asking for and then accepting interbank offers in a reasonable market size just prior to 11 o'clock? Well, that's 11 o'clock British time. So in other words, if you were trying to borrow money at 11 o'clock for one of these 35 different fixings that we're talking about, so as I say, we're talking about 7 different maturities and 5 different rates, what would be the rate that you think you could borrow money for from? So basically, these reference banks, who typically had AA credit ratings, would have to come up with 35 different numbers. Now, the problem, of course, is that some of these numbers are just inevitably going to be estimates, because there simply wasn't enough interbank borrowing and lending to estimate LIBOR from actual transactions. And since 2012, as I'm sure you know, it's become clear that the estimates from some large banks were manipulated, and there was collusion between banks. And furthermore, even in 2012, it was estimated this collusion had been going on for quite some time. Why might a bank want to manipulate LIBOR? In other words, not make a good estimate of what the rate they could borrow at, but maybe shade it up or down. Well, it might have transactions dependent on the LIBOR fixing. For example, let's take that swap. I think it was, we talked about, it was a 5-year swap, 3-month LIBOR exchanging for 2.5%. Let's suppose that was a really, really big transaction that a bank had entered into. Clearly, the 3-month LIBOR fixing on a reset date is very important to the bank, because it's going to determine the exchange that will take place 3 months later. So if the bank is receiving LIBOR and paying 2.5%, then obviously it wants a high fixing for LIBOR. If it's the other way around, if it's paying LIBOR and receiving the 2.5%, it's going to want a low fixing for LIBOR. And there was a certain amount of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, as the English phrase goes, as far as this is concerned. So you help me to get a large or a small LIBOR fixing today, and I'll help you when you need one tomorrow or the next day. So that's one reason. That's the first reason why a bank might want to manipulate LIBOR. The second reason is that it just might want to appear to have a high credit rating. So if you're concerned that, if you think people are concerned about your credit rating, you might want to give a low value for the LIBOR fixings to indicate that you can borrow money at a relatively low rate. So as I say, this was, exposed in 2012, and there have been many lawsuits since then. One trader, this Tom Hayes, who worked for UBS and Citi, has served over 5 years in prison as a result of LIBOR fixing. And I'm sure you've heard some of the telephone conversations and emails that have gone backwards and forwards on the fixing of LIBOR, clearly indicating that, this was happening. So what's the phase-out plan? Having decided that LIBOR is not a good reference rate, even though it's so universally used for, let's say, about $500 trillion of transactions, clearly, if it's not a reflection of real interest rates, rates that are actually being used for borrowing in the market, and it's just a number that is subject to manipulation, then the feeling was that we had to replace it by something else. So we'll talk about the something else in a minute, but the phase-out plan is that there'll be no LIBOR calculations for bank quotes for 4 of the currencies after the end of 2021. So we're already in this period now where there are no LIBOR calculations in the old way of doing it for the British pound, the euro, Japanese yen, and Swiss franc. Okay, and then for US dollar, LIBOR creates more of problems because there's many more transactions on US dollar LIBOR. And so 2 of the maturities for US dollar LIBOR are not going to be quoted after December the 31st, or are not being quoted after December the 31st, 2021. And there'll be that leaves 5 maturities for US dollar LIBOR, and quotes for those other five maturities in US dollar LIBOR will continue until the middle of 2023, June the 30th, 2023. But there's should be no new US dollar LIBOR transactions after the end of last year, after December the 31st, 2021. Now, one of the problems is that, of course, transactions which were entered into in the past can continue well past these deadlines. You know, in fact, transactions dependent on LIBOR can last anything from 1 day to 30 years. So some transactions are going to continue for a long time. And sort of to help with the phase out, synthetic LIBOR quotes are being produced by ICE for 1, 3, and 6 month British pound and Japanese LIBOR. Now, I'll explain what I mean by synthetic LIBOR quotes a little bit later, but those synthetic LIBOR quotes are going to continue until the end of 2022. Okay, so that's how we're getting rid of LIBOR. So what are the replacement rates? And the rates which regulators have come up with to replace LIBOR are the ones listed here. So as far as US dollar is concerned, they're replacing, all of these rates are overnight rates. You know, it seems very strange to be replacing, say, a 6-month rate with an overnight rate. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but all of these are overnight rates. The US dollar replacement is SOFR, S-O-F-R, which is a repo rate, which means it's a secured rate. For the British pound, it's SONIA. For the euro, it's ESTA. For the Japanese yen, it's TONA. And for the Swiss franc, it's SERON. So, you know, 2 of those, as I say, are repo rates, and the other 3 are unsecured overnight rates. But they're all pretty low risk rates, because not much generally can go wrong as far as overnight lending is concerned. Now we've got similar, of course, reference rates being used in other countries. In my own country, Canada, we've got this CARA rate, which is repo, a repo rate. In Mexico, we've got the overnight Thai funding rate, which is a repo rate. And in Chile, you've got PDBC. So, yeah, this is all very well, but, you know, how does it work when we replace, say, a 6-month rate by an overnight rate, or a 3-month rate by an overnight rate? And there's a big, you know, a couple of really important differences here. Let's focus on, say, the 3-month LIBOR rate. The 3-month LIBOR rate's known at the beginning of a 3-month period. So if I'm borrowing money and the 3-month LIBOR rate applies, I know what rate I'm going to pay for a 3-month period at the beginning of the 3-month period. Okay, I'll pay the interest at the end of the 3-month period, but I know what it is at the beginning of the 3-month period. And that's kind of what we're used to. We're used to knowing the rate that we'll be paying at the beginning of the period to which it applies. But that's not how these overnight rates work. And because the way the overnight rate will work, if we do say a loan that's dependent on that pays interest every 3 months, but is dependent on the overnight rate, the way it will work is that you'll observe the overnight rate for the first day of the 3-month period, and then you'll observe it for the second day of the 3-month period, the third day of the 3-month period, and you'll compound those overnight rates together to get what the total overnight rate is for the 3-month period. And that's what's represented by this little formula here that R1 is the overnight rate for the first day of the 3-month period, and D1 is the number of days it applies to. So normally that'll be 1 day. But if we're talking about a weekend, for example, then it might be 3 days, or if there are holidays and so on. So whereas the Ds with the hats on are usually 1 day, but except for weekends and holidays and so on. So we're calculating these rates, compounding them, and working with a 360-day period. But the key thing is, we don't really know the rate we're going to pay until the end of the 3-month period. Okay, because as we get closer and closer to the end of the 3-month period, we become more and more certain about the rate we'll pay, because we've seen quite a lot of the overnight rates, but we don't know the final rate until the end of the 3-month period. So if we accept these overnight rates as being replacements for, this $500 trillion of transactions, we've got to get used to this business that, we only know the rate that we'll pay, or the rate that, if we were talking about a swap, the rate that we'll exchange, we only know that at the end of the period. So we'd have to get used to thinking about interest rates in arrears rather than in advance. Now, of course, market participants are very inventive, and they're now producing estimates of the forward rates for the new reference rates from contracts such as futures and swaps, because we have contracts on these overnight rates, contracts on, say, 3 months SOFR rate, which gives us an idea of what the market expects the daily compounded 3-month rate to be for the next 3 months. So market participants are producing estimates of the forward rates for the new reference rates from contracts such as futures and swaps on overnight rates. And I mentioned earlier about these synthetic rates that ICE is producing. And my understanding is that those synthetic rates are produced from forward rates. So as to say, one of the key differences between the new reference rates and the old reference rates are, old reference rates are known in advance, the new reference rates known in arrears. The other difference is that LIBOR incorporates some credit risk, whereas the new rates are essentially risk-free. In fact, they're referred to as RFR, risk-free rates. And this means that they're a different sort of rate as far as transactions are concerned. LIBOR, most of the time, the difference between LIBOR and one of these RFRs, risk-free rates, is about 10 basis points, quite small. But when there's a huge amount of uncertainty in the marketplace, a lot of credit risk out there, the spread between the risk-free rate and US dollar LIBOR, it actually rose to 364 basis points, during the crisis. Of course, at the end of the crisis, it came down again. But the key thing is that LIBOR incorporates, this sort of overall market uncertainty or the overall sort of level of credit risk in the market in the way that the new rates don't. And, when you transact with somebody and you say the rate will be such and such plus 50 basis points or something like that, maybe you actually want the rate, during crisis conditions to reflect the fact that it's a crisis and for the reference rate to go up. And LIBOR had that property, but the new rates don't have the property. So one question is, will the market be comfortable with these new reference rates? The overnight the overnight rates that regulators want to use to replace the to replace LIBOR, this discredited rate of LIBOR, and perhaps they won't. There's a couple, there are a number of different, in the US market, there's a number of different rates that have been proposed as replacements for LIBOR, which are different from the ones that the regulators want to use. There's this Bloomberg Short-Term Yield Index, BUSBY, which seeks to estimate the average yield at which large banks access unsecured funds, but it's based on actual transactions. Okay, and this is the difference between it and LIBOR. LIBOR was, what rate do you think you could borrow at? Whereas BUSBY is based on actual transactions, and there's some curve fitting going on. Another one is Ameribor, which is created by the American Financial Exchange, and it reflects the actual borrowing costs of thousands of community and regional banks in the US, and produces 30-day, 90-day rates and 7-day secured rates and so on. So it's too early to say at this stage, but one of the interesting questions is, which rates is the market going to settle down to using? And I think we don't really know that yet. There is a fallback protocol that, if a company has entered into a relatively long-dated transaction with a bank that's dependent on LIBOR, it may be that the two sides will reach some agreement that when we stop getting quotes from LIBOR, this is what's going to happen. But if they don't reach an agreement, there's a fallback protocol which ISDA has come up with, basically saying that we replace LIBOR with the corresponding risk-free rate. So if it's US dollar, it would be SOFR and so on. If it's British pound, it would be SONIA. We replace it by the risk-free rate plus a spread. And the spread is calculated in the way that's indicated here. So it's the median value of the excess of LIBOR over this risk-free rate during the previous 5 years. So basically you look over the previous 5 years and see what the spread has actually been on average. Actually, you take the median and use that. So there's legislation in some countries that this is what will happen. So that things won't be disrupted too much. One of the interesting questions is, what's happening to markets that, the exchange traded markets that depend on LIBOR. And, as you probably know, the most successful futures contract in the US has been the Eurodollar futures contract. And that provides a payoff dependent on 3-month LIBOR. And of course, if we don't know 3-month LIBOR, we can't provide the payoff that way. So what I've shown here is volume of trading and open interest for Eurodollar futures. Just a few weeks, it was March the 18th. So it was, it's about a month ago. And you can see there's still a healthy volume of trading in Eurodollar futures. Alt habits die hard, and the open interest is really high. And the same is true of Eurodollar futures. Then you can say, well, one of the things about Eurodollar futures, they've been such a successful contract that the maturities go out to 10 years for Eurodollar futures, well beyond the time when LIBOR will cease to exist. LIBOR will cease to be quoted in the US dollar for the US dollar after the middle of 2023. So you can see that actually what I did was I sort of looked at the contracts that mature before the middle of 2023 and the contracts that mature afterwards. And you can see there's, a roughly equal volume in both. Now, what the CME has said is that actually these Eurodollar futures contracts will be converted into SOFR futures contracts, SOFR futures contracts. So really what these people are doing is they're trading SOFR futures. But as I say, and they could trade SOFR futures directly, but as I say, old habits die hard, and so they're continuing to trade the Eurodollar futures. When I looked at this in June 2021, SOFR futures were not that popular. The volume was, compared with the numbers we've just looked at, the volume was about 67,000 and the open interest, about 600,000. When I looked again in March 2022, that had increased a lot. So people have adjusted, even though there's still a big open interest in Eurodollar futures, people are trading SOFR futures directly. And to some extent is happening with options as well. So let me close by, posing this key question for derivatives markets, and you may have some views on this. What will be the most liquid reference interest rate for things like, interest rate swaps, caps, floors, FRAs, and indeed, borrowing and lending? What will be the most liquid short-term exchange traded product when the dust settles? In other words, we're going through a transition period still now, and the market's trying to decide, do we go with Busby? Do we go with, Ameribor? Do we go with some of these forward rates, or do we just settle on, do we just acknowledge the fact that, we're going to have to get used to working with interest rates in arrears, with these overnight rates, which will only known in arrears? Reason, of course, why regulators have chosen these overnight rates is because there's a huge volume of actual trading in the overnight rates compared with, the amount of trading there was to base the LIBOR quotes on originally. Anyway, that completes my presentation. I'd be happy to hear any questions you have. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Dr. Hall, por tan interesante exposición. Seguimos ahora entonces con un espacio para responder preguntas de nuestros participantes. Y solo un recordatorio, asegúrense de escribir sus preguntas en el cuadro que aparece en su panel de control para que podamos hacerlas. Para aquellos que acaban de unirse a nosotros, bienvenidos. En caso de que no hayan tenido la oportunidad de escuchar a nuestro experto, Dr. Hall, en la primera sesión del Financial Challenge, la grabación del webinar va a estar disponible en el canal de YouTube de V-Metrics y en la web vmetrics.com. Tenemos entonces algunas preguntas de nuestros participantes y la primera llega desde México, la hace Martín González a Mr. Hall. Entendiendo que varios clientes no están acostumbrados a saber la tasa del cupón del swap que van a pagar, se ha propuesto un producto swap llamado, al menos en México, SOFR Term, donde se acuerda definir la tasa in advance. ¿Cree que este producto prevalezca y sea lo que le falta a la SOFR en general risk-free rates para ser aceptadas al 100% por el mercado? ¿O simplemente es cuestión de acostumbrarse al nuevo método de cálculo del cupón hasta el vencimiento?
Well, I think that's getting at the heart of the issue, as I understand the question. Will we, as a financial community, will we get used to thinking in arrears and saying, no, we don't really know what rate we're going to pay until the end of the relevant period, or will we
el final de un periodo
say that, you know,
relevante,
that's just
o
not good
vamos a
enough, we've
decir,
got to come up
bien,
with
esto
some
no es
other reference
suficiente,
rate.
vamos a tener algún
And
otro
you know, I
tipo
think
de
it's an
tasa de
open question.
referencia. Creo que
There's
es
obviously a
una
lot of
pregunta
interest. I mean,
abierta.
LIBOR
Hay
is a
mucho
very, very
interés,
popular
digamos,
rate.
LIBOR es
And
una tasa
these other
muy
rates like
popular.
Amobor
Estas otras
and so on are designed to
tasas
sort of
que podemos ver
imitate
se han
LIBOR.
diseñado
People got
para
so used to
imitar a
LIBOR and
LIBOR,
liked it
porque
so much.
LIBOR, la gente se ha acostumbrado mucho
So,
a
you know, if
esta
I had to
tasa
predict,
LIBOR.
I would
Así que si yo
say
tuviera que
that,
predecir, yo diría que
we will probably end up
probablemente vamos a
going with the overnight
terminar,
rates just because there's
vamos
such
a
a huge
seguir
amount of
con los
liquidity in the
overnight
overnight
rates,
rates.
con los
But
intereses
the forward
diarios. Yo
contracts on
creo que
overnight rates
antes
and that sort of
de
thing
los
will become
contratos, estos
very
van a
important
partir siendo
in terms of
muy
understanding
importante
the
este
rate that's
overnight
likely to
rate,
be paid, and maybe
tasa
we'll even
diaria.
transact
Y así
relative to
incluso
the
vamos a
forward
hacer
futures
transacciones
rates.
para el futuro. en
Muchas
este
gracias,
tipo de-
Mr. Hall. Vamos con otra pregunta para usted. ¿Cuáles riesgos y desafíos ve para los bancos al crear estos productos?
Well, the challenges for banks are really
Los desafíos
sort of
para los bancos
making the
son
transition. There's a huge amount of
realizar
documentation
las transacciones
that's,
con una gran
based on the
cantidad de
LIBOR rates,
documentos que aparecen
that
en las
documentation
tasas de
has to be
LIBOR
moved
y
over
esta
to a new rate.
documentación se tienen que llevar a una nueva tasa.
You know,
Ustedes saben
the regulators have been trying to make this as
que
easy as
los
possible.
están tratando de hacerlo
For
lo más
banks,
fácil
there's,
posible para los
There's some
bancos.
fallback
Eh,
provisions, as I said in
Hay
my presentation.
provisiones de los bancos, así como dije en mi
But,
presentación.
you know,
Pero
if two sides have a contract
hay,
that maybe
si dos
lasts
partes
another 10
tienen
or
un
20 years,
contrato
that
y van
depends
a
on
durar
LIBOR,
10 o
and they
20
haven't
años,
actually reached
esperamos
an
que pase
agreement
con
as to how
LIBOR
that contract is
y
going to
no
be
han
amended,
llegado a un
and
acuerdo
they're not
para hacer
comfortable
una
with the
enmienda
fallback position,
y no
then,
están
you know,
cómodos
it's going to
con
waste a lot
la
of time
posición. Bueno, ahí se va a perder
negotiating,
mucho tiempo en
you
la
know, how
parte
the
de la
terms of the contract should be
negociación de
changed.
cómo se
So
van
I
a
think
cambiar los
you
términos
know,
de la
that's the
negociación.
real
Yo
challenge
creo que este es el
for
desafío
banks
principal.
is sort of just
Los
changing the terms of the
bancos están
contract
cambiando los
from one
términos de
reference
los
rate to
contratos
another.
de una tasa de
Because the old
referencia
reference
a
rates no
otra,
longer exist.
porque
Now, you've got a little bit longer to do it with the US
se van a
dollar
demorar un
rates,
poco más al hacerlo con las tasas
but,
del
you know,
dólar,
the middle of
pero
2023 will
en
come
medio
really
del
fast.
2023 ya esto va a ser muy
Muchas gracias
rápido.
por su respuesta, Mr. Hall. Ahora vamos a pasar con una pregunta para el equipo de V-Metrics, para ti, Sebastián. Pregunta Francisca de Chile. ¿Cuál ha sido la experiencia de V-Metrics y su software en la implementación de las Free Risk Rates?
Muchas gracias, Javiera. Bueno, este proceso de cambio es muy grande para las instituciones, ya que tienen muchos contratos derivados dentro de su sistema, la mayoría de ellos legacy. Entonces, cuando nosotros hemos realizado este proceso, tanto aquí en Chile como en México, hemos evaluado diferentes procesos, no solamente técnicos o de software, sino también relacionados a los procesos que se tengan a contratos, a metodologías y a la parte tecnológica. Hoy día hemos sorteado 2 procesos de implementación con bancos locales y bancos de Latinoamérica para la migración o la transición de esta LIBOR a software. Lo hemos hecho con un equipo con mucha experiencia relacionado a temas técnicos y funcionales. Prácticamente hoy día estamos saliendo a producción con ambos proyectos. Gracias.
Le preguntamos a Luis también si es que quiere complementar.
Sí. ¿Cómo ves tú, Luis, la implementación que hemos tenido en nuestros clientes?
Hola. Bueno, pues
No.
en general,
Sounds really impressive.
¿sí me escucha?
You know, I should have mentioned in answer to the
Hay
previous question that it's not
mencionado
only
en la
financial
pregunta anterior que no solo son
that,
instituciones financieras.
you know, have a lot of problems as a result of the
Tenemos
LIBOR
muchos
transition, but of course
problemas en
software
las
companies as well.
transiciones
And,
también tenemos problemas con las
Almost
compañías de
every bit of
software y hemos
software
visto.
that's got
Pero
anything
con-
to do
hay-
with interest rates that
que
a
no hay
financial
con
institution
software que no
has
tiene nada que
is going to
ver
be
con
impacted
lo que
by
son
this transition away from
lo que
LIBOR.
son los
So,
softwares van a tener un
Yeah,
impacto
I'm really
también
pleased
en
that
esta
V-Metrics
transición.
is
Estoy realmente
ahead of the curve
satisfecho
on this
con
one.
V-Metrics y lo que
But
han
it is,
hecho,
you know, it's a big challenge.
pero es un gran desafío.
Gracias.
You know, it's you know, practically every part of a bank's
Son de un banco prácticamente.
software and
Ustedes saben, tenemos los softwares,
the bank's interaction with its customers,
las
and
interacciones
derivatives
de
and
los
other
bancos
contracts
con
is
sus
impacted.
clientes, las derivativas de los contratos, etcétera.
Gracias, Mr. Hall. Seba, ¿quieres invitar a Luis entonces a complementar y participar también?
Sí. Bueno, bienvenido Luis, desde México nos acompaña. Luis, básicamente el líder de la implementación de servicios profesionales para nuestra área de riesgo. No sé si quieres complementar, Luis, la respuesta que tuve con respecto a las implementaciones que ya llevamos en Latinoamérica. ¿Qué te parece este cambio relacionado de la transición LIBOR a SOFR y cuáles son los desafíos que también tenemos para nuestros clientes?
Hola, ¿qué tal, Sebastián? Gracias.
Well,
¿Me escuchan bien, verdad?
You're the expert. I'm not.
No.
I'm not really.
¿Se escucha Luis o no?
¿Sí? ¿Me escuchan a mí?
Sí, ahí te escuchamos, Luis.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Okay.
Ah, vale. Pues, digo, así es un desafío que tiene varias aristas, ¿no? El primero es la parte de los momentos de transición, particularmente en el momento en el que se hace el cambio de la tasa vieja LIBOR a la SOFR, ¿no? Ese momento en el que pues ha habido distintas formas de atacarlo, de diferentes, por ejemplo, las cámaras, ¿no? Que hacen cash settlements y cosas así. Entonces, toda esa parte en un sistema transaccional, pues es un desafío, y hacia adelante la parte técnica, ¿no? Que tendremos que implementar con los nuevos métodos de bootstrapping, double bootstrapping, etcétera, en los sistemas para construir todas estas nuevas curvas, pues ha sido una parte retadora, pero bueno, al menos en las implementaciones que se han hecho hasta el momento se ha logrado, y bueno, más adelante y en los siguientes webinars de este año veremos la parte de XVAs, donde pues también va a estar bastante impactado por este cambio a ya tener una verdadera risk-free rate, ¿no?
Gracias, Luis. Y
Gracias,
equipo de V-Metrics, vamos con otra pregunta que es de Roberto de Perú. Quiere saber cómo administran software en el sistema. Seba, partes tú.
Bueno. A finales de este año, como comenté en la introducción de este webinar, nosotros estaremos lanzando nuestra primera plataforma, yo diría que una de las primeras en el mundo, de un sistema Software as a Service o Full Software as a Service para la administración de activos y portafolios de inversión. Nuestro approach o solución que tenemos para la software es que prácticamente sea ready to use. Ustedes podrán ingresar a ese sistema y la curva ya estará creada, obviamente hoy día enfocada en software. Entendemos que hay otros índices que estaremos implementando, ¿cierto?, en diferentes sprints del próximo año. Sin embargo, hemos realizado con el equipo un estudio acabado de cómo implementarlo para Latinoamérica, y cuando puedan ingresar al sistema, este estará disponible sin mayores implementaciones. Por lo tanto, hoy día, básicamente lo que hemos tratado de hacer es tener un sistema totalmente acabado con respecto a todas las métricas e índices que hay en Latinoamérica y en el mundo entero en nuestro sistema para que se pueda aplicar.
Luis, no sé si quisieras agregar algo, si no pasamos con la última pregunta para el Dr. Hall.
Vale, no, pasemos a la siguiente pregunta.
Súper. Dr. Hall, última pregunta viene de Carlos Romero. ¿Cómo impactará la CBDC de Estados Unidos entre cualquier otra moneda electrónica similar futura basada en los bancos centrales, la regulación de las operaciones regulares con las nuevas tasas? Lo escuchamos.
Let me make sure I understand the question properly. Are you talking about
Quiero
digital
verificar la
currencies here?
pregunta. ¿Están hablando de monedas
Did I
digitales?
get that right, or?
¿Hablan de monedas digitales? ¿Alguien me escucha?
Yes. Yes. Well, I'm not an expert on digital currencies, but there's
En
no
monedas
question.
digitales, pero
So,
no hay pregunta, no hay.
all a lot of countries are looking at CBDCs
Hay muchos
right
países
now,
que están
central bank
viendo
digital currencies,
CBDC,
and we can
que lo
expect
que
a lot of
son las
change
monedas digitales, y esperamos muchos
over the
cambios
next few years.
en los siguientes años.
So whether digital currencies will,
Si las monedas
prove to
digitales
be a
van
replacement for LIBOR,
a ser
I would
un
have quite a
reemplazo
doubts
de
about that,
LIBOR,
but,
yo tendría
I've
algunos
been wrong
reparos
before,
en
so we'll
esto.
wait and see what happens.
Así que, pero esperemos y veamos qué es lo que puede ocurrir con esto.
Vimos todas las preguntas de nuestros asistentes. Les agradecemos especialmente por habernos acompañado, por su activa participación. Dr. Hall, entiendo que su último libro, Machine Learning in Business, An Introduction to the World of Data Science, ha tenido una excelente recepción, dado que presenta una visión general y accesible sobre esta temática. ¿Podría entregarnos finalmente una visión general de los principales temas que abarca su libro, ya que el próximo webinar de B-Metrics será de este interesante tema y así nuestra audiencia puede ir adelantando e interiorizándose más sobre el tema?
Yeah, well, machine learning has
Machine
in the last
learning
5 years has become a
está
major
en los
interest of mine.
últimos
I think it's
años ha
becoming
sido de
more
gran
and more
interés. Yo
important
creo que
in
cada
finance.
vez es más
Algunas
importante en el área
And as
financiera
far as both my
y
research and my teaching is
en
concerned,
investigación.
it's
Y
all
en
focused
cuanto a
around
mi
machine
enseñanza,
learning.
se
There's
enfoca
quite a lot
en
of applications of
machine learning. Sé que hay
derivatives
muchas
in
aplicaciones
other
en
areas as
machine
well.
learning en distintas áreas que se puede
Yeah, I
utilizar.
do have a book. Here it is.
Yo sí
This is
tengo
the
un
latest
libro.
version, actually. It's the third
No hay más
edition.
Esta es la
preguntas.
última versión.
And it's
Esto se
you know,
refiere,
it's designed for
está
business executives
diseñado
and business
Benito.
students.
para los
So it's not
ejecutivos,
designed for computer science people. That's one of the things
no
that
está
distinguishes
diseñado
it
para
from
las
other books
personas
in
de
this area.
computación. Y eso es
It's,
importante definir en este libro y en,
but
otra,
basically, it's
en
designed
otras
to
áreas.
explain the tools
Básicamente
that
está
data
diseñado
scientists
para
use
diseñar las
and the
herramientas y
terminology
sus
they
usos
use
y la
so
terminología
that
que utilizan.
business students, business
Los
executives can work
los ejecutivos y los estudiantes
with
pueden
data
trabajar
scientists. So
con
it's not designed to convert
data
them into data
scientists.
scientists. Also, I have
No
to say some of my
pensamos
students do
convertirlos
become data
en
scientists, but
científicos en lo
you know,
que
that's
es
not the purpose
data,
of the book. The
aunque a
purpose of the
veces
book is
pasa
to
con nuestros
enable
estudiantes,
the
pero ese
reader
no es
to
el
work
propósito.
productively
Es capacitar
with
al
data scientists. So
lector
we'll be talking
en lo que
about
tiene que ver con
that
data scientists.
on
Así
my
que
next
ahí
presentation.
voy a
I'll
estar
be
hablando en mi
giving
siguiente
you a
presentación.
very
Les voy a estar
abbreviated
entregando
sort of presentation
una
of a
presentación
very popular elective
abreviada
that I teach
sobre
actually
un
at
grupo
the
lectivo
Rotman School,
que es muy
University of
popular
Canada.
que enseño en
So I'm looking
una
forward to that.
enseñanza que doy en la universidad.
Ahí
Y
nos vemos.
realmente estoy
Gracias por ese
ansioso
resumen,
de
Dr. Hall.
presentarlo.
Sebastián, creo que
Ok.
tú querías también complementar.
Muy reconocido por la industria. De hecho, yo comencé leyendo estos libros hace muchos años atrás. Por lo tanto, haremos un sorteo de este interesante texto en quienes hayan permanecido conectados a nuestro webinar. Nos contactaremos con ustedes, con el ganador, y les estaremos informando. Obviamente, nuestro equipo interno hará todo el proceso. Muchas gracias.
Buenísimo, ahí nos vamos a contactar obviamente con el ganador o la ganadora. Y ahora es hora de cerrar este primer evento del Financial Challenge. Agradecemos muchísimo a todos su participación. Estamos muy contentos de haber compartido con ustedes, con Mr. Hall en esta interesante conferencia. Recuerden que en agosto nos volvemos a reunir para otra interesante sesión a cargo también de Mr. Hall, esta vez centrada en el avance de la transformación digital y el Machine Learning en la industria financiera. En los próximos minutos la grabación va a quedar completa y disponible en events.vmetrics.com y en vmetrics.com para quienes deseen revisarla o compartirla a través de sus redes sociales. Nuevamente, muchas gracias por acompañarnos hoy día y nos vemos en una próxima oportunidad.
Faces come and go, pictures fading fast, voices turning low. so